I told my aunt I could not wait for my sister Vanessa's wedding next week. She went dead silent and told me it already happened. Weeks later, my sister called to borrow my private lake house. I simply said no. My name is Naomi. I am 32 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a multi-million-dollar real estate mogul, I escaped their toxicity, but kept my true wealth a secret, playing the role of a struggling freelancer to protect my peace. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The morning began with a false sense of anticipation that I had carefully cultivated over the past 6 months. I was sitting at the small desk in my decoy apartment in Atlanta, sorting through two expensive fabric swatches. One was a deep emerald green silk, and the other was a rich sapphire blue satin. I was trying to decide which color would look best in the background of family photographs. For my entire life, I had been the family outcast, the daughter my parents Beatrice and Marcus kept hidden in the shadows, while my younger sister Vanessa soaked up all the sunlight. Vanessa was 29, an image-obsessed public relations influencer who spent every waking moment curating a fake life of luxury to impress the Atlanta elite. I, on the other hand, had deliberately crafted a persona as a socially awkward freelance scheduler who barely made ends meet. It was a camouflage that kept their relentless greed directed elsewhere, while I quietly built a property management empire worth tens of millions of dollars. Despite their constant microaggressions and endless criticism, I still held on to a tiny fragment of hope that I would be included in the most important day of my sister's life. Vanessa was marrying Preston, a 33-year-old white man who constantly bragged about his old money Connecticut roots. My parents worshipped the ground he walked on, viewing him as their ultimate ticket into high society. I picked up my phone and dialed Aunt Denise, the only person in our entire extended family who had ever shown me genuine warmth and respect. When she answered, her voice carried the familiar comforting tone that had soothed me through countless childhood disappointments. I held the fabric swatches up to the sunlight, streaming through my window. I told her I was looking at dresses and asked if she thought I should wear the emerald or the sapphire to Vanessa's wedding next Saturday. I explained that I wanted to look nice, but did not want to stand out or do anything that would trigger one of my mother's famous lectures about my appearance. The silence that followed my question was immediate and heavy. It was not the kind of pause where someone is simply thinking about an answer. It was a thick, suffocating quiet that made the air in my small apartment feel incredibly thin. I called her name twice, thinking the connection had dropped. When Aunt Denise finally spoke, her voice cracked with a mixture of profound confusion and deep sorrow. She asked me what I was talking about. She said the wedding in Charleston had already happened last Saturday. The words did not process right away. My brain rejected the information, trying to find a logical explanation. I told her she must be mistaken because the save the date card Vanessa had sent me months ago clearly stated the wedding was next weekend. Aunt Denise let out a heavy breath that sounded like a sob. She explained that she had seen the photographs online. She saw the grand Charleston estate, the massive floral arrangements, my parents beaming in their formal wear, and Vanessa walking down the aisle with Preston. Aunt Denise had not been invited either, but she assumed it was because she was extended family. She never imagined they would exclude the bride's own sister. I set the fabric swatches down on my desk. The smooth silk and shiny satin suddenly looked ridiculous. A cold wave washed over my entire body, starting from the top of my head and settling deep in my chest. For 32 years, I had endured being the punchline to their jokes, the target of their condescension, and the recipient of their bare minimum effort. But this was different. This was a calculated, premeditated act of cruelty. They had sent me a fake save the date card with a false date to ensure I would not show up and ruin their perfect aesthetic. They had spent months talking to me about wedding planning details that were entirely fabricated just to string me along. I did not cry. There were no tears left for people who could orchestrate such a massive deception just to spare themselves the supposed embarrassment of my presence. The little girl inside me, who had always hoped for her family's acceptance, died in that exact moment. In her place, emerged the woman who negotiated cutthroat commercial real estate deals, who stared down aggressive investors, and who commanded a boardroom with absolute authority. I thanked Aunt Denise for telling me the truth. I promised to call her back later and ended the connection. I sat in the silence of my apartment for exactly 5 minutes, letting the cold reality harden my resolve. I opened my phone and scrolled through the family group chat. The last message was from my mother 2 days ago, complaining about the humidity. They were playing a sick game, and it was time to end it. I tapped the video call button and waited for the cowards to answer. The video call connected after a few agonizing rings. The screen split into 3 separate squares showing my mother Beatrice, my father Marcus, and my sister Vanessa. They were all lounging in what looked like a spectacularly expensive bridal suite. The room behind them featured vaulted ceilings, antique mirrors, and plush velvet seating. Vanessa was wearing a white silk robe trimmed with ostrich feathers, holding a crystal flute filled with a mimosa. My parents were dressed in designer casual wear, looking completely relaxed and incredibly smug. They greeted me with fake cheerful voices, asking why I was calling so early on a weekend. I did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. I looked directly into the camera and asked them how the wedding in Charleston was. The shift in their demeanor was instantaneous and deeply satisfying to watch. My father nearly choked on his coffee. My mother's fake smile vanished completely, replaced by a look of sheer panic. Vanessa, however, simply rolled her eyes and took a slow, deliberate sip of her mimosa. She did not look guilty or ashamed. She looked annoyed that she had been caught. I asked them again, keeping my voice perfectly level. I demanded to know why they had sent me a fake date, and why my own sister had excluded me from her wedding. Vanessa sighed heavily, setting her drink down with a sharp clink against a glass table. She leaned into the camera and delivered a speech so dripping in venom it was almost breathtaking. She told me to listen closely. She explained that Preston's family represented the absolute pinnacle of elite Connecticut old money. She said his parents were prominent figures who summered in the Hamptons and rubbed shoulders with senators. She looked at me with undisguised disgust and told me she could not possibly have me stumbling around her elegant reception in my discount rack clothes. She mocked my introverted nature, claiming I would just stutter through conversations and make everyone uncomfortable. Then she delivered the final blow. She explicitly stated that I was socially unfit for an event of that magnitude, and that by leaving me off the guest list, she was actually doing me a favor and saving us both a massive embarrassment. I waited for my parents to intervene to scold Vanessa for her cruelty, or at least attempt to soften the blow. Instead, Beatrice adjusted her expensive necklace and nodded in agreement. She told me that I needed to understand the delicate social politics they were navigating. She said Vanessa had worked incredibly hard to secure a white, wealthy husband and to elevate our entire family's status in the Atlanta social scene. My father Marcus chimed in, adding that I should know my place. He reminded me that I was 32 years old, completely single, and scraping by typing on a laptop for pennies as a freelance scheduler. He told me not to be bitter and jealous just because my sister had achieved the kind of success I could never dream of. They begged me not to make a scene and ruin Vanessa's special moment. I stared at the 3 of them, capturing this image in my mind forever. They were a trio of desperate status-chasing social climbers who were so blinded by their proximity to supposed white wealth that they gladly discarded their own flesh and blood. They had internalized so much hatred for their own origins that they viewed my quiet, simple life as a disease they might catch. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults or demand an apology. I simply looked at the camera and told them that I understood perfectly. Before they could offer another pathetic excuse, I pressed the end call button. I immediately went into my phone settings and blocked Vanessa, Beatrice, and Marcus. I blocked them on every social media platform and restricted their email addresses. I moved through my decoy apartment with surgical precision, packing a single overnight bag with my essential items. I grabbed my laptop, my secure hard drives, and my keys. I walked out of the tiny studio that they constantly mocked and took the elevator down to the secure underground parking garage. I bypassed the battered sedan I normally drove to family events and walked over to my custom luxury SUV. I pulled out of the city and merged onto the highway heading north toward the mountains. I was driving to my sanctuary. 5 years ago, I had purchased a massive private estate on a secluded lake using a corporate holding company to ensure complete anonymity. The lake house was a $4.5 million architectural masterpiece of glass, stone, and steel nestled against a private shoreline. It was the crown jewel of my real estate portfolio and my absolute favorite place to escape the noise of the world. My family thought I occasionally house sat for a wealthy client when I needed extra cash. They had absolutely no idea that I was the owner. I drove for 2 hours watching the city skyline fade into rolling hills and dense forests. I felt no sorrow or regret during the drive. The toxic weight of trying to please people who despised me was finally gone. I pulled up to the heavy iron gates of the estate, entered my security code, and drove down the winding tree-lined driveway. When I walked through the massive mahogany front doors and looked out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the pristine lake, I took my first real breath of freedom. I was completely unbothered. I had a business to run and a life to enjoy, and I was never looking back. 3 beautiful and completely silent weeks passed at the lake house. My days were highly structured and deeply fulfilling. I woke up early each morning to practice yoga on the expansive wooden deck overlooking the water. I spent my afternoons in my home office negotiating property acquisitions and managing my portfolio of high-end commercial spaces across the country. I was closing a massive deal in downtown Chicago that would boost my company's valuation by another 20%. I drank expensive wine, cooked gourmet meals in my chef's kitchen, and enjoyed the absolute peace that comes from removing toxic people from your life. Not a single thought of my family's betrayal interrupted my peace. On a bright Tuesday afternoon, I was reviewing a stack of architectural blueprints when my private personal phone rang. This was the number I reserved strictly for business emergencies and a very select group of trusted contacts. I glanced at the screen and saw an unknown local number. Assuming it might be a contractor, I answered with my standard professional greeting. The voice on the other end made my blood run cold. It was Vanessa. Her tone was sickeningly sweet and artificially enthusiastic, as if the brutal confrontation 3 weeks ago had never occurred. She had clearly used a burner phone app to bypass the block I had placed on her actual number. She greeted me by calling me sister with an exaggerated musical lilt. Before I could hang up, she launched into a rapid-fire monologue. She announced that Preston's parents were flying down to Atlanta from Connecticut for a surprise visit. She complained that their house in the city was far too small to entertain people of their elite caliber. Then she got to the true purpose of her call. She told me they desperately needed to host an ultra-exclusive post-wedding reception to impress his family and their high society friends. She said she knew I was just a lowly property manager for that crazy rich owner of the lake house up in the mountains. She demanded that I sneak her the keys and grant her access to the estate for a massive 3-day party. The sheer audacity of her request left me temporarily speechless. She had excluded me from her wedding because I was allegedly a social embarrassment, but now she wanted me to risk my supposed employment to provide her with a free luxury venue. She laughed a high-pitched nervous sound and added that I owed her a massive favor and an apology for my terrible attitude during our last video call anyway. She told me to stop holding a grudge and just text her the gate access codes by the end of the day so the caterers could begin setting up. She spoke with the absolute entitlement of a spoiled child who believed the world existed solely to serve her aesthetic needs. I leaned back in my leather ergonomic chair and looked out at the sunlight sparkling on the surface of the lake. I thought about the multi-million-dollar insurance policy I held on the property, the priceless artwork hanging on the walls, and the pristine condition of the hardwood floors. I thought about Preston, a man I had only met twice who carried himself with the unearned arrogance of someone who believed wealth made him invincible. I brought the phone closer to my mouth and kept my voice completely devoid of any emotion. I told Vanessa a single word. No. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The sickeningly sweet facade evaporated instantly. Vanessa's voice dropped an octave, trembling with rage. She demanded to know what I meant by no. She reminded me that we were family and that family helps each other. She threatened to call my employer and tell them I was uncooperative. She screamed that I was a bitter, jealous loser who was trying to sabotage her marriage because no man would ever want me. She demanded the keys again, insisting that her reputation was on the line and that Preston's family would judge them if they did not provide an adequate venue. I listened to her unhinged tantrum for a few seconds longer, allowing her to fully expose the depths of her desperation. It was pathetic to hear a grown woman begging for access to a lifestyle she clearly could not afford on her own. Without offering a single explanation or apology, I hung up the phone. I immediately blocked the burner number and returned to my blueprints. I had drawn a hard boundary, and I was confident that was the end of the situation. I drastically underestimated the lengths to which desperate people will go to maintain their lies. The villains in this story were not used to being denied, and they were about to bring their circus directly to my front door. The next morning, aggressive pounding on my front door rattled the cheap brass hinges of my decoy apartment. I kept this rundown studio precisely to maintain the illusion of my struggling freelance existence. I glanced at the security feed on my phone and let out a sharp breath. It was my mother Beatrice and my sister Vanessa. They were pacing the narrow hallway outside their designer heels, clicking impatiently. I paused my real estate portfolio spreadsheet, locked my laptop screen, and walked over to unbolt the door. Before I could even offer a greeting, Vanessa pushed violently past me, bringing the heavy scent of her floral perfume into my cramped living space. My mother followed close behind, wrinkling her nose in pure disgust as she surveyed the modest thrift store furniture I deliberately used to decorate the room. They did not bother to sit down or ask how I was doing. They stood in the center of my worn rug, radiating a frantic, chaotic energy that felt entirely out of place. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly and glared at me with absolute contempt. She skipped any pleasantries and demanded to know why I was being so stubborn about a simple request. She yelled that her new in-laws were arriving in 72 hours and she absolutely needed that lake house to host a luxury welcome reception. I leaned casually against the kitchen counter, crossing my ankles to show I was not intimidated. I kept my voice perfectly calm and reminded her that I had already given her my final answer yesterday on the phone. I told her the property was not mine to lend, and my employer did not do favors for strangers who simply wanted to throw a party. My mother stepped forward, her face instantly flushing with deep red anger. She pointed a sharp manicured finger directly at my chest. She told me that if I did not get my sister that lake house, I should consider myself completely dead to this family. She screamed that she would not allow my petty jealousy to ruin Vanessa's standing with Preston elite relatives. She demanded to know if I wanted Preston family to think we were poor. She ordered me to call my boss right this second and beg for the keys. I did not flinch at the threat of being disowned. They had practically disowned me for years, already treating me like a shameful secret. But as I watched my mother chest heave with panicked breaths and saw the genuine terror flashing in Vanessa's eyes, my business instincts kicked into high gear. I routinely negotiate multi-million-dollar commercial acquisitions. I know exactly how to read people, and the math in this room was simply not adding up. Preston supposedly came from an untouchable old money Connecticut dynasty. His family supposedly summered in the Hamptons and had unlimited resources. So why were his wealthy parents expecting my middle-class Atlanta family to provide a luxury venue? Furthermore, why was Vanessa sweating through her silk blouse over a simple party location? If Preston was as rich as they claimed, he could effortlessly rent a grand ballroom or buy out an entire country club for the weekend. Yet here they were standing in my dingy apartment screaming at the sister they despised, begging to borrow a house for free. The frantic energy they projected reeked of severe financial desperation. They were hiding something massive, and Preston was hiding something even bigger. I realized, in that exact moment, that this was not just about a party. This was a trap they were building for themselves. If I simply said no and kicked them out, they would find another way to fake their wealth, and the toxic cycle of their abuse would continue. But if I gave them exactly what they asked for, I could expose the deep rot at the core of their entire existence. I could peel back the shiny layers of Preston's supposed wealth and force my family to face the humiliating reality of their shallow ambitions. I dropped my defensive posture and let my shoulders slump, adopting the persona of the beaten-down, obedient daughter they expected me to be. I looked down at the floor, acting as though my mother's harsh threat had finally broken my spirit. I told them to calm down. I said I did not want to be cut off from the family and I would see what I could do to help. I lied smoothly, explaining that my boss was strict, but might be willing to rent the property for the weekend if they signed the proper liability paperwork and assumed all risks. Vanessa let out a dramatic sigh of relief, immediately transforming from a screaming tyrant back into a smug, entitled socialite. She told me she knew I would eventually come to my senses and realize my basic duty to the family. My mother adjusted her designer purse and praised Vanessa for handling the situation so elegantly, completely ignoring the fact that she had just threatened to erase me from her life. I told Vanessa to bring Preston to the local coffee shop down the street tomorrow morning. I explained that I would bring the necessary contracts from my property management company, and if Preston signed them, they could have the lake house for the weekend. Vanessa agreed, instantly waving her hand, as if signing a highly restrictive legal document was a trivial inconvenience. They marched out of my apartment without offering a single word of gratitude, leaving the front door wide open behind them. I walked over and quietly clicked the deadbolt firmly into place. I walked back to my desk and opened my laptop. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I pulled up a fresh high-stakes liability agreement from my corporate legal files and began typing. They wanted the keys to the kingdom. I was going to hand them the absolute keys to their own spectacular downfall. The smell of burnt coffee and cheap artificial vanilla filled the cramped local coffee shop down the street the next morning. I arrived exactly 15 minutes early, securing a corner booth with a clear view of the entrance. On the scratched wooden table, I placed a thick manila folder containing the heavily modified legal agreement. Precisely at 10 o'clock, the glass door swung open, and Vanessa marched in, her chin held high as if she were walking a Paris runway instead of stepping into a neighborhood cafe. Behind her strode Preston, looking every bit the caricature of a Connecticut old money heir. He wore a flashy double-breasted navy blazer with gold buttons, structured trousers, and loafers without socks. But as he stepped into the light of the menu board, my trained eye immediately locked onto the wrist he purposefully exposed. He was sporting a luxury Swiss watch, but the bezel was slightly misaligned, and the sweep of the second hand stuttered ever so subtly. It was a cheap replica, a AAA counterfeit manufactured overseas. A real multimillionaire wouldn't be caught dead wearing a fake mechanism, let alone bragging about it. Preston did not even look at the young girl working behind the counter. He raised his hand and sharply snapped his fingers at the barista, waving a crisp $100 bill in the air. He demanded 2 iced macchiatos, with an unbearable tone of unearned privilege that made the couple at the next table turn and stare. Vanessa slipped into the booth across from me, her eyes tracking my movements with an impatient hunger. Preston joined her, throwing his arm over the back of the vinyl seat, invading my space before the drinks were even delivered. He did not ask how I was doing. He smirked and told me he hoped I brought the right keys this time, because his family did not tolerate administrative delays. I ignored his condescending tone completely. I reached into the manila folder and slid a dense 15-page legal document across the sticky tabletop. I looked Preston directly in his eyes, watching for any sign of actual legal literacy. I explained that my boss had reluctantly agreed to the arrangement, but under very strict corporate conditions. I told him that as the official representative and property manager of the estate, I required both of them to sign this $4.5 million strict liability and asset protection agreement before a single gate code could be issued. I pointed to the dense paragraphs of fine print, explicitly stating that the document legally outlined their personal and corporate responsibility for any damage to the high-value assets. I also made sure to verbally emphasize that by signing, they were giving explicit legal consent to the 24/7 surveillance security cameras operating in all common areas of the property. Preston let out a loud, arrogant laugh that echoed off the cafe walls. He reached into his blazer pocket, pulled out a heavy gold pen, and leaned forward with a look of supreme confidence. He scoffed and told me that $4 million was absolute pocket change for a family with his pedigree in Connecticut. He said his family foundation routinely handled transactions 10 times that size without blinking. Vanessa smiled smugly beside him, nudging his shoulder as if his financial arrogance were a badge of honor. She told me to stop acting like a nervous secretary and just give her husband the pen so they could finalize the plans. Preston did not read a single clause. He did not scan the indemnification sections, nor did he review the asset liquidation penalties hidden on page 9. He simply flipped to the final signature page, scribbled his name with an aggressive flourish, and shoved the folder back into Vanessa's hands. Vanessa signed right beneath his name, her signature looping and messy, eager to secure her dream of high society validation. I took the folder back, checking the signatures carefully before closing the manila flap. The trap was set, and the financial noose was now officially tied around both of their necks. Preston had just legally bound his non-existent assets to a multi-million-dollar corporate contract, and Vanessa had signed away her remaining financial security for a weekend of clout. I pulled out a small printed card from my pocket and slid it across the table. It contained the temporary security gate code for the outer perimeter of the mountain estate. I told them the staff would have the grand ballroom and the private dock prepped by Friday afternoon. Preston grabbed the card, stuffed it into his pocket, and stood up without saying another word. Vanessa gave me a final condescending look, telling me to ensure the catering staff wore proper uniforms because she did not want her new mother-in-law seeing anything tacky. They walked out of the coffee shop, leaving their untouched macchiatos on the table. I sat alone in the booth, pulled out my secure tablet, and uploaded the signed contract directly to my primary corporate attorney with a single instruction: prepare for asset discovery. Friday evening arrived with a breathtaking sunset that painted the sky above the lake in shades of bruised purple and violent orange. I stood in the kitchen of my own multi-million-dollar estate, dressed in a plain black catering uniform. The floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the main hall reflected the frantic energy of my family. Vanessa was sprinting across the imported Italian marble floors, adjusting floral arrangements she had bought on credit. Beatrice was smoothing down her overly formal gown, while Marcus nervously checked his watch. At exactly 6 o'clock, a black town car pulled through the heavy iron gates I had remotely unlocked. Preston stepped out onto the circular driveway, pulling at the collar of his suit jacket. He opened the rear door for his parents. Arthur and Eleanor Vance emerged looking exactly like the stock photos for a high-end yachting catalog. Arthur wore a pastel sweater draped over his shoulders, and Eleanor had a permanent sour expression etched into her heavily lifted face. Beatrice and Marcus rushed out the front doors, practically tripping over themselves to greet the in-laws. I watched from the kitchen island, plating expensive hors d'oeuvres as the sickening display began. Eleanor Vance did not offer a hug or a handshake. She looked at my mother's outstretched arms and took a deliberate step back, clutching her designer purse tighter against her side. She looked up at the towering glass facade of the house and let out a dry, humorless laugh. She remarked that it was certainly a very modern structure and asked Beatrice if her people were used to spending time around open water. I gripped the edge of the granite counter, expecting my parents to feel the sting of the blatant racial insult and finally stand up for themselves. Instead, Beatrice let out a shrill, desperate laugh. She clapped her hands together and enthusiastically agreed, stating that the estate was just a modest little getaway for Vanessa and Preston. Marcus puffed out his chest and eagerly asked Arthur about his flight. Arthur waved his hand dismissively and said the commercial first class was passable, but nothing compared to the private charters his family usually took when they summered in the Hamptons. Beatrice gasped with manufactured delight, pressing her hands to her cheeks. She exclaimed how wonderful it was that his family summered in the Hamptons and asked if they enjoyed the polo matches. They moved into the grand foyer, and Vanessa immediately spotted me standing near the catering trays. She snapped her fingers loudly, pointing at the floor. She ordered me to take Mr. and Mrs. Vance's coats, and to make sure I did not smudge the fabric with my greasy fingers. Eleanor Vance handed me her coat without looking at my face. She turned to my mother and loudly observed that it must be so convenient to have hired help that comes from the same background, ensuring there are no communication barriers. Beatrice smiled tightly, swallowing the massive insult, and assured Eleanor that their staff was highly trained to be completely invisible. I took the coats and bowed my head slightly, playing the perfect silent servant. I picked up a silver tray loaded with crystal champagne flutes and followed them into the main living area. Arthur was holding court near the massive stone fireplace, swirling his drink. He was asking Marcus how a man like him managed to afford the property taxes on such an estate. He added a vile little chuckle, stating that he assumed the neighborhood association had very strict vetting policies to prevent certain undesirable demographics from moving into the area. Marcus swallowed hard, his jaw clenching for a fraction of a second before the pathetic, eager smile returned to his face. He assured Arthur that their family was highly educated and heavily invested in the community. Eleanor chimed in, examining her manicured nails. She said she was simply shocked that a property this magnificent was not owned by someone they already knew from their elite country club circuit. She looked directly at me as I offered her a flute of champagne. She took the glass, holding it by the very edge of the stem. She looked at my plain uniform and asked me if I understood how lucky I was to work in a house with indoor plumbing. Vanessa rushed over, her face flushed with extreme anxiety. She quickly told her mother-in-law that I was just a temporary worker covering a shift and that I barely spoke English. She shooed me away with rapid hand gestures, treating me like a stray dog that had wandered into the house. I lowered my eyes and backed away, retreating to the kitchen. I did not care about Eleanor's racism or Vanessa's desperate lies. What caught my attention was Preston. He was not standing by his new bride defending her family or boasting about the house. He was pacing near the glass doors leading to the back patio, running his hands through his hair and staring obsessively at his phone. The confident, arrogant scammer from the coffee shop was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he was about to face an execution squad. I walked down the hall to the coat room, feeling the heavy keycard in my pocket. I did not feel humiliated by my family's desperate fawning. I felt a cold, clinical satisfaction. They were performing a grotesque play, and I was the director holding the script. I hung up the coats and slipped into the temperature-controlled pantry just off the main kitchen. I pulled my secure tablet from behind a row of expensive imported olive oils. I opened the proprietary security application for the estate. When Preston and Vanessa signed that $4.5 million liability contract, they had explicitly consented to 24/7 audio and visual recording in all common areas. I tapped the screen, activating the hidden high-definition cameras installed in the chandeliers, the bookshelves, and the patio fixtures. The screen split into 12 crystal-clear grids showing every angle of the party. I watched my parents bowing and scraping to people who viewed them as less than human. I watched Preston sweating profusely as he downed his third glass of whiskey and stared at the dark driveway. I tapped another button, routing the live feeds directly to an encrypted offshore cloud server. Every racist comment, every desperate lie, and every piece of financial fraud they were about to commit was being permanently archived. The trap was fully operational, and the rats were making themselves right at home. I emerged from the temperature-controlled pantry just as a sudden sharp noise cut through the ambient chatter of the living room. It was the distinct, insulting sound of snapping fingers. I turned to see Vanessa glaring at me from across the expanse of imported Italian marble. She raised her hand and snapped again, treating me with less respect than one might give a disobedient animal. She barked a command across the room, telling me to get her new mother-in-law a fresh glass of Chardonnay immediately. She then lowered her voice to a harsh hiss as I approached, but made sure it was loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. She told me not to embarrass her and commanded me not to speak unless I was spoken to directly. My mother, Beatrice, stood right beside her, adjusting her heavy pearl necklace and nodding in vigorous agreement. She shot me a warning glare, silently reinforcing Vanessa's cruel directive. I did not react with anger or hurt. I simply bowed my head in a perfect imitation of subservience and turned back toward the kitchen. I walked into the private wine cellar, a room I had custom designed with mahogany racks and precision climate control to house my personal collection. I bypassed the standard catering wine Vanessa had cheaped out on and selected a bottle of vintage Chardonnay that cost more than her entire bridal gown. I poured a generous measure into a pristine crystal flute, placing it precisely on a polished silver tray. I smoothed down my plain black uniform and walked back into the fray of fake wealth and fragile egos. Eleanor Vance was holding court near the grand piano. She was gesturing broadly with her empty hand, complaining to my parents about the supposedly exhausting ordeal of managing multiple vacation properties across the eastern seaboard. Beatrice was hanging on her every word, her eyes wide with manufactured sympathy, agreeing that finding reliable estate staff was simply impossible these days. I approached the group, quietly keeping my gaze respectfully lowered and my steps measured. I offered the silver tray directly to Eleanor. She did not take the glass immediately. Instead, she stopped her story and looked me up and down with an expression of unfiltered revulsion. She let out a long, dramatic sigh and turned to Vanessa, who had just hurried over to join the circle. Eleanor complained loudly, stating that her family hired help was incredibly slow. She remarked that back in Connecticut, the staff knew to anticipate a guest's needs before their glass was even empty. She then looked back at me, her lips curled into a prominent sneer, and added that she supposed one could not expect premium service from local labor. The racial and classist undertones of her comment were painfully obvious, hanging in the air like a foul odor. The immediate circle grew thick with sudden tension. I watched my father Marcus shift his weight uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the floor rather than meeting my gaze. I watched my mother Beatrice freeze, her desperate smile faltering for only a fraction of a second. They had a choice in that exact moment: to defend their own daughter from a blatant insult, or to swallow their pride to stay in the good graces of this terrible woman. Predictably, they chose cowardice. Beatrice let out a high, nervous laugh and quickly apologized on my behalf, assuring Eleanor that I was just a temporary worker who was clearly out of my depth. Vanessa stepped forward, her face flushed with anxiety, and hissed at me to apologize to her mother-in-law immediately. She threatened to have me thrown off the property by security if I ruined the evening. I looked at Vanessa, taking in her panicked eyes and the cheap fabric of her supposedly designer dress. I looked at Eleanor Vance, who wore her entitlement like a suit of armor despite the fact that I knew her family was financially drowning. I did not break eye contact as I offered the tray 1 inch closer. I smiled, a polite, practiced, and utterly cold smile. I spoke in a clear, steady voice that carried perfectly over the surrounding chatter, ensuring they all heard me. I apologized to her directly, stating that I was very sorry for the delay. I explained that I was busy ensuring the estate high-value assets were properly secured. Eleanor finally took the crystal flute from the tray, but her brow furrowed in deep confusion. The comment was completely over her head. She did not understand the double meaning or the fact that I was actively building a federal criminal case against her own son right under her nose. She simply dismissed me with a flick of her wrist, taking a sip of my expensive wine and telling me to be quicker next time. Vanessa glared at me furiously, silently demanding that I disappear from their sight. My parents let out a collective sigh of relief that the moment had passed without further incident, immediately resuming their pathetic fawning over Eleanor's stories of country club politics. I turned and walked away, leaving them completely consumed by their delusions of grandeur. The noise of the party faded slightly as I moved down the long corridor toward the back of the house. The grand reception was nothing more than a masquerade ball where everyone was lying about who they were and what they had. Vanessa was pretending to be wealthy. My parents were pretending to belong. Eleanor and Arthur Vance were pretending they were untouchable elites. and I was pretending to be the maid while holding the deed to the entire stage. I reached the heavy oak door at the end of the hall. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner disguised as a decorative wall sconce. The lock clicked open silently, and I slipped inside the security control room. The space was dark, illuminated only by the soft blue glow of a massive bank of monitors covering the entire wall. I locked the door behind me and sat down in the command chair, breathing in the quiet isolation. The screens displayed every corner of the estate in high definition. I could see the caterers refilling the buffet line. I could see my parents desperately trying to engage Arthur Vance in a conversation about golf. I could see Vanessa posing for photos near the infinity pool, ensuring she got the perfect angle for her social media followers. But I was not interested in the party guests anymore. I tapped the control board, bringing camera feed number 7 to the center screen and expanding it. The camera was located in the secluded east hallway, far away from the music and the laughter. It was the one place in the house where a person might go if they needed absolute privacy. And right there, pacing furiously back and forth across the custom-woven runner, was Preston. His expensive suit jacket was unbuttoned and his tie was pulled loose. He was holding his phone tight against his ear, his face contorted into a mask of pure panic. He was completely unaware that the crystal chandelier directly above his head housed a directional microphone that was capturing every single word of his desperate conversation. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the console, and turned up the audio feed. It was time to find out exactly what kind of monster my sister had married. The audio feed crackled with a burst of static for a brief second before the noise-canceling filters kicked in, stripping away the distant hum of the string quartet playing in the main hall. Preston's voice came through the high-definition speakers with startling clarity. He was breathing heavily, his words rushed and ragged. "Listen to me," he hissed into the receiver. He paced in a tight, agitated circle, his loafers squeaking slightly on the polished marble. "I told you I have the collateral." He paused violently, dragging a hand across his forehead to wipe away a thick layer of sweat. The smug, untouchable aristocrat who had just demanded a fresh drink and sneered at my parents was completely gone. In his place was a terrified man standing on the edge of ruin. "This lake house is worth almost $5 million, Preston spat out. His voice dropped an octave, dripping with a desperate, threatening edge that masked absolute panic. "I am getting the deed signed over this weekend. Just give me 48 hours. Tell your boss to back off or I will call the cops." A tinny, distorted voice bled through his phone speaker. I adjusted the equalizer on the console, straining to catch the words, but the caller's voice remained a low, menacing rumble. Whatever the man on the other end said, it instantly drained the remaining color from Preston's face. His jaw went slack, and he stopped pacing. "You cannot do that," Preston pleaded. The threat of calling the police had vanished, entirely replaced by raw begging. "I am marrying into the family. It is a done deal. The asset is practically mine." The call abruptly disconnected. Preston pulled the phone away from his ear, staring at the darkened screen with wide, horrified eyes. He let out a guttural sound of frustration and shoved the phone into his blazer pocket. Then, with a sudden and explosive burst of rage, he lashed out. He swung his right leg and violently kicked a heavy antique ceramic vase resting on a decorative mahogany pedestal next to the window. The heavy vase toppled backwards, striking the floor with a dull, echoing thud. Miraculously, the thick ceramic did not shatter, but the impact reverberated through the audio feed like a gunshot. I sat back in the heavy leather command chair, my eyes wide as the massive, twisted reality of the situation locked into place. Preston was not just a pretentious snob wearing a counterfeit watch. He was a desperate, calculating fraud who was in incredibly deep with very dangerous people. He was not marrying my sister for love, and he certainly was not marrying her to merge two wealthy dynasties. He was actively trying to steal the house. My mind raced as I processed the sheer audacity of his scam. He had targeted Vanessa, zeroing in on her desperate need for high society validation. He had listened to my mother's pathetic, exaggerated lies about our family's non-existent wealth, and he had believed every single word of it. He actually thought my middle-class parents owned this spectacular waterfront estate. He had orchestrated this entire engagement, dragged his fake aristocratic parents into the charade, and demanded this specific venue, all to swindle his way onto a multi-million-dollar property deed. He intended to use the fake marriage to force my parents to sign over the estate planning to immediately liquidate the asset to pay off his dangerous creditors. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. The absolute irony of the situation was almost too perfect to comprehend. It was a spectacular collision of two monumental frauds. Preston thought he was running a high-stakes con on a family of wealthy, gullible fools. He thought he was securing his ultimate financial salvation. He had no idea that my family did not own a single square inch of this property. They were nothing but desperate imposters renting a lifestyle for the weekend, wearing clothes they could barely afford and pretending to be royalty. And the greatest trap of all had already been sprung. Preston had just blindly signed a corporate strict liability and asset protection agreement in that dingy coffee shop. He thought he was signing standard event paperwork to gain access to his new family's summer home. He thought he was tricking me, the lowly sister, into handing over the keys to his salvation. But in reality, he had just legally assumed absolute financial responsibility for every single high-value asset on the property. If his creditors came looking for collateral, they would find a legally binding document tying Preston to $4.5 million of corporate liability, not ownership. I quickly turned back to the control console. I hit a series of keystrokes isolating the video clip of his violent outburst and extracting the high-quality audio file of his desperate phone call. I encrypted the files and transferred them directly to a secure partitioned drive on my off-site cloud server. This situation had escalated far beyond exposing my family's toxic vanity. This was a calculated criminal conspiracy. I now possessed the exact leverage needed to destroy Preston completely and legally protect my employer's property from his dangerous associates. On the primary monitor, Preston was frantically trying to hide his loss of control. He bent down, grunting with exertion, and hoisted the heavy ceramic vase back onto its mahogany stand. He furiously smoothed his hair back into place, adjusted the lapels of his blazer, and took a deep, shaky breath. I watched him instantly slip his arrogant mask back onto his face. He turned and walked purposefully back toward the grand hall, preparing to rejoin the party and continue playing the role of the untouchable billionaire heir. I locked the security system, wiping the recent access logs, and slipped my tablet back into its hidden compartment behind the olive oils in the pantry. I smoothed down my black catering apron and squared my shoulders. The dynamic of the entire evening had just violently shifted. Preston was a ticking time bomb, desperate to get his hands on a deed that did not exist. My family was too blinded by their own greed and desperation for proximity to whiteness and wealth to see the explosion coming. I picked up an empty silver serving tray and stepped back out into the bright, noisy hallway leading to the main reception. I was going to let them all continue their pathetic performance. I was going to let Preston dig his own grave deeper, watching every single fake smile and listening to every arrogant boast, knowing exactly how this spectacular tragedy was going to end. I set the empty silver serving tray on the stainless steel prep counter and slipped quietly out of the kitchen, taking the servant staircase down to the estate, reinforced lower level. I needed absolute silence and maximum bandwidth. I entered the secondary management office, locked the heavy acoustic door behind me, and sat down at the massive oak desk. I flipped open my secure laptop, the screen casting a harsh white glow across the dark room. My employer, a massive international commercial real estate conglomerate, provided executives at my level with access to elite military-grade background check software. We routinely use the system to ruthlessly vet multinational corporate tenants and high-net-worth buyers before authorizing any property leases. Tonight, I was going to use it to digitally dissect my new brother-in-law. I pulled up the scanned copy of the $4.5 million strict liability and asset protection agreement Preston had so arrogantly signed at the coffee shop. I copied his full legal name, his date of birth, and the social security number he had foolishly scrawled on the final signature page. I pasted the raw data into the main terminal search field, added the names of the shell LLCs he had listed as his primary business entities, and hit enter. A green progress bar crawled across the bottom of the screen as the software ruthlessly scraped federal tax records, banking histories, civil court filings, and international financial databases. I expected to find inflated net worth statements, or maybe a few hidden tax liens. I did not expect the spectacular, catastrophic avalanche of red flags that suddenly flooded my monitor. The screen blinked, generating a comprehensive financial autopsy of the Vance family dynasty. There was no dynasty. The pristine, old-money Connecticut facade was a complete and utter fabrication. According to the federal bankruptcy filings illuminating my screen, Arthur and Eleanor Vance had lost everything in 2012. Their regional manufacturing business had been liquidated to pay off massive corporate debts. Their supposed Hampton summer estate had been foreclosed on and sold at a public bank auction 14 years ago. They currently lived in a heavily mortgaged condo, drowning in late payments and surviving entirely by maxing out a rotating carousel of high-interest credit cards to fund their country club memberships. But Preston's individual file was infinitely worse. I clicked on his primary LLC, a company he claimed managed offshore tech investments for elite clients. The software immediately flagged the entity as a defunct shell corporation tied directly to a massive collapsed cryptocurrency scheme. Preston was not a venture capitalist. He was a low-level crypto scammer who had played with money he did not have. The deep dive revealed a labyrinth of desperate financial maneuvers, culminating in a terrifying reality. He had leveraged non-existent assets to borrow heavily from the absolute worst kind of people. The database pulled flagged financial reports and offshore wire tracking, showing that Preston currently owed $3 million to a highly organized, notoriously violent loan shark syndicate operating out of Miami. The panicked phone call I had just recorded in the hallway suddenly snapped into terrifying focus. The Miami syndicate was calling in his debt. They wanted their $3 million, and Preston had promised them the signed deed to a $5 million waterfront estate to save his own life. He had targeted my sister because my parents spent every waking moment projecting the illusion of limitless wealth. Preston thought he was marrying into a gullible, cash-rich family that would blindly hand over the keys to a luxury property he could immediately liquidate. He thought Vanessa was his golden ticket to survival. A dark, uncontrollable urge took hold of me. My fingers flew across the keyboard. If Preston was a total fraud, I needed to know exactly what he was legally attaching himself to. I typed in Vanessa's full legal name and her social security number, running a complete financial diagnostic on my own sister just out of pure morbid curiosity. The system processed her information in seconds. The results loaded, and I had to physically cover my mouth with my hand to stop a loud burst of laughter from echoing through the basement. Boom! The numbers flashed in bright crimson across the digital dashboard. Vanessa was absolutely drowning. Her financial profile was a graveyard of terrible decisions, fueled entirely by her desperate need to appear elite. She possessed exactly zero tangible assets. Instead, the screen displayed a staggering $150,000 in outstanding credit card debt. She had maxed out cards at every luxury retailer, jewelry boutique, and high-end salon in the city. But the crowning jewel of her financial ruin was a massive, highly predatory personal loan taken out just 6 months ago. The interest rate was astronomical, bordering on extortion. I tracked the disbursement of the funds. Every single penny of that predatory loan had been drained to pay for the extravagant, over-the-top Charleston wedding where she had officially tied herself to Preston. She had literally mortgaged her entire future to throw a party designed to impress a family of bankrupt imposters. I sat back in the glow of the monitors, absolutely mesmerized by the sheer poetic justice of the situation. Two broke, desperate, shallow scammers had found each other in the wild. They had both faked their way into a marriage completely blind to the truth, each secretly believing the other was a multimillionaire who would solve all their financial problems. Preston thought he was scamming a wealthy heiress for a lake house deed to pay off the Miami mob. Vanessa thought she was marrying a Connecticut aristocrat who would wipe out her massive retail debt and elevate her to high society. They were two parasites trying to feed off each other, and there was absolutely no blood left to take. They had legally bound themselves to one another, merging their catastrophic debts and dangerous liabilities into one massive sinking ship. And tomorrow morning, when Preston tried to finalize his grand theft, the entire illusion was going to detonate. I closed the laptop, the satisfying click echoing in the silent room. The trap was not just set, it was already springing. The heavy industrial laser printer in the corner of the management office whirred to life. It began spitting out page after page of undeniable catastrophic truth. I stood there and watched the financial executions of Vanessa and Preston print out in crisp black ink. Bankruptcies, defaulted corporate loans, extortionate interest rates, and wire transfer logs detailing deep connections to the Miami loan shark syndicate. I gathered the thick stack of papers. The still warm sheets felt heavy in my hands. This was not just a dossier of background checks. It was a loaded gun, and I was about to walk right out there and pull the trigger. I grabbed a sleek black leather portfolio from the bottom desk drawer and slid the documents inside, snapping the magnetic closure shut with a satisfying final click. I bypassed the busy servant corridors and took the private spiral staircase up to the second-floor mezzanine. The wraparound balcony offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the grand reception hall below. I stood in the shadows, my hands gripping the cold wrought iron railing, and looked down at the masquerade ball. Vanessa and Preston were holding court right in the center of the room. They were a picture-perfect portrait of elite generational wealth. A hired photographer circled them like a hungry shark, snapping hundreds of photos for Vanessa's meticulously curated social media feeds. Preston held my sister's hand, kissing her knuckles with practiced aristocratic charm. Vanessa threw her head back in manufactured laughter, her eyes darting around the room to ensure everyone was properly admiring her fake diamonds and her fake billionaire husband. They were absolutely disgusting. They were putting on a desperate theatrical performance while standing on a financial landmine they had built together. From my vantage point, the cracks in their facade were glaringly obvious. Preston was sweating profusely through his tailored designer suit. His eyes constantly flicked toward the main entrance, waiting for the loan sharks to arrive to collect their $3 million. His jaw was clenched so tight, I was surprised his teeth did not shatter. Vanessa was desperately clinging to his arm, completely oblivious to his panic. She was too busy calculating how this marriage would elevate her social status to realize the man she thought was her golden ticket was actually a concrete anchor tied around her neck. The heavy oak double doors at the front of the hall swung open and the ambient noise in the room shifted slightly. Aunt Denise had finally arrived. She was my father's older sister, the only person in the entire bloodline who completely refused to participate in my parents' delusions of grandeur. She wore a simple, elegant navy pantsuit, completely ignoring the absurd black-tie dress code my mother had demanded on the invitations. Denise had built a modest but highly successful chain of regional hardware stores through sheer grit and 80-hour work weeks. She hated everything about the fake society circles my parents desperately tried to infiltrate. She took one look at the oversized ice sculptures and the imported caviar stations, and her face contorted into an expression of unfiltered disgust. Before my mother could swoop in and berate her for being late or underdressed, I quickly descended the staircase and intercepted Denise in the coat-room lobby. She took one look at my plain black catering uniform and frowned, her sharp eyes narrowing in immediate understanding of the disrespect I was enduring. She opened her mouth to aggressively scold my parents for treating me like the hired help, but I held up a hand to stop her. I pulled her roughly by the elbow into a private soundproofed cloakroom and locked the heavy door behind us. Denise demanded to know what was going on and why I was serving drinks at my own sister's wedding. I did not waste time with pleasantries or explanations about my undercover status. I unzipped the black leather portfolio and handed her the thick stack of printed financial documents. I told her to stop asking questions and read the highlighted sections immediately. I watched her eyes quickly scan the pages. Her initial confusion rapidly morphed into pure, unadulterated shock. She looked at Preston's $3 million debt to the Miami syndicate, and then she flipped the page and looked at Vanessa's $150,000 in retail debt and predatory wedding loans. She dropped the papers onto a mahogany side table as if they were physically burning her hands. She asked me if this information was actually real. I told her it was absolute undeniable fact pulled directly from federal and private databases. I explained that two completely broke, desperate scammers had just married each other, each fully believing the other was their ultimate financial salvation. Denise let out a sharp, incredulous bark of laughter. She shook her head at the sheer monumental stupidity of her niece and her new nephew-in-law. Then her expression hardened into a look of absolute steel. She looked me up and down, finally realizing I was holding all the cards. She asked me what the plan was. I told her the climax of this pathetic play was approaching rapidly and I needed her to do exactly as I said. I instructed Denise to casually make her way back into the main hall and stand directly by the grand foyer exits. I told her to intercept my parents if they panicked and tried to run, and to make absolutely sure no one from Preston's fake family managed to quietly slip out the back doors when the explosion happened. Denise gave me a fierce, confirming nod. She did not ask for further details. She simply tucked her purse securely under her arm and marched out of the cloakroom, taking up her tactical position by the main doors, like a seasoned general preparing for a siege. I was left alone in the quiet cloakroom. I pulled out my secure management tablet from my apron pocket. I brought up the master security application that controlled the entire property. The screen displayed the perimeter map in glowing blue lines. I tapped the primary access controls. I bypassed the standard security protocols and engaged the absolute lockdown override. Heavy reinforced steel gates slid silently shut across the main driveway, locking into place with electromagnetic seals. The secondary service exits automatically bolted. The perimeter sensors flashed red on my screen, indicating total containment. I locked the estate down completely. Nobody was leaving this property until the show was entirely over. I tucked the tablet away, grabbed the black leather portfolio filled with financial ruin, and stepped out into the bright hallway. I stepped out of the soundproofed cloakroom and let the overwhelming noise of the Saturday night reception wash over me. The grand main ballroom was a chaotic, glittering sea of fake wealth and fabricated prestige. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of roasted duck, spilled champagne, and the suffocating perfume of desperate social climbers. Atlanta socialites draped in heavily altered designer gowns rubbed shoulders with Preston's carefully curated entourage of grifters, all of them pretending to be elite venture capitalists and tech moguls. The refined string quartet had been dismissed, replaced by a loud, overpriced live band, blaring generic jazz covers to keep the energy artificially high. Crystal glasses clinked continuously, forced laughter echoed off the vaulted ceilings, and flashbulbs fired incessantly as Vanessa posed with her new, supposedly aristocratic in-laws. I wove through the dense crowd, keeping my head respectfully lowered, playing the part of the invisible servant to absolute perfection. I needed a moment away from the suffocating masquerade to stash my black leather portfolio in a secure location before initiating the final phase of my plan. I slipped unnoticed through the heavy swinging double doors leading into the massive industrial catering kitchen. The sudden quiet was a stark contrast to the booming party outside. The catering staff was entirely out on the floor, managing the complex main course service, leaving the vast, gleaming room of stainless steel and black granite completely deserted. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the commercial walk-in refrigerators. I moved toward the back pantry to hide the damning financial documents when the heavy, swinging doors burst violently open behind me. The sudden, aggressive noise made me turn sharply. Preston stormed into the kitchen, his face flushed a blotchy red, and his chest heaving with shallow, ragged breaths. The charming, untouchable mask of the billionaire groom had completely evaporated. He looked exactly like what he was, a cornered animal, manic, sweating, and incredibly dangerous. He frantically scanned the empty kitchen, his wild eyes finally locking onto me standing near the prep station. He did not see the true property manager holding the literal keys to his destruction. He only saw a desperate, easily intimidated low-wage worker he could exploit to save his own skin. He marched directly toward me, closing the distance with aggressive, predatory strides that echoed sharply against the tile floor. I stood my ground firmly behind the massive central granite island, smoothly sliding my leather portfolio onto the lower storage shelf, completely out of his line of sight. He reached the island and violently slammed a thick manila envelope onto the pristine granite countertop with a loud, cracking smack. The flap tore open from the force, revealing thick, banded stacks of crisp $100 bills. He did not stop there. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored tuxedo jacket and slapped a perfectly ironed legal document right next to the cash. I glanced down, my eyes analyzing the text in a fraction of a second. It was a blank power of attorney form, specifically drafted with aggressive legal jargon to grant unilateral control over the estate's deed, modifying ownership rights and financial liabilities. "Listen to me very carefully," Preston demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, commanding whisper that vibrated with raw panic. He leaned heavily over the granite island, invading my personal space, the smell of expensive scotch and cold sweat rolling off him. "You are just a poor, low-level scheduler. You manage the administrative calendar for this property. That means you have direct access to your boss's digital signature and the corporate seal." He aggressively tapped the thick stack of cash with a violently trembling finger. "There is 10 grand right there, cold hard cash. That is probably more money than you make in 6 entire months carrying silver trays and fetching wine for people like me. It is yours free and clear, tax-free." He shoved the legal document across the smooth granite directly toward my chest. "I need you to forge your boss's signature on this power of attorney form right now. I have a massive, incredibly time-sensitive business deal closing this exact weekend, and I need to use this house as temporary collateral to secure the capital. It is a mere formality, a paperwork bridge. No one will ever know, and you walk away $10,000 richer." The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of his demand was staggering. The dark irony of the situation threatened to pull a laugh from my throat. He owed $3 million to a violently dangerous Miami loan shark syndicate, and he was offering me a pathetic $10,000 bribe to commit federal corporate fraud so he could steal a $5 million property my family did not even own. It was the desperate, flawed math of a ruined man. I looked down at the dirty cash, then at the fraudulent document, and finally brought my gaze up to meet his panicked, bloodshot eyes. I did not reach for the pen he held out. I did not flinch. I just stared at him with complete, icy, uncompromising silence. My absolute refusal to immediately submit to his demands shattered whatever tiny fragment of composure he had left. Preston let out a low snarl and lunged forward across the wide granite island. His hand shot out like a viper, and he grabbed my arm in a vice-like punishing grip. His fingers dug painfully into my skin through the thin fabric of my black uniform, his perfectly manicured nails biting down hard. "Do you understand who you are dealing with, you stupid girl?" He hissed, his face now inches from mine, his breath hot and reeking of desperation. "I am marrying into this family tomorrow. I am going to own this entire estate. If you do not do exactly what I tell you to do, right this second, I will completely ruin you." His grip tightened, his eyes wide with a terrifying, unhinged intensity. "I will make one single phone call to the property management firm and ensure you are immediately fired for theft. I will tie you up in litigation so fast your head will spin. I will personally make sure you never work in this state again. You will be blacklisted, ruined, and begging on the streets by Monday morning. You are nothing. Now pick up the damn pen and sign the paper." I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away. I did not shrink back or show a single ounce of the fear he so desperately wanted to see. I simply stared at his manicured fingers digging into my uniform, as if they belonged to a mildly disgusting insect that had somehow crawled onto the pristine granite counter. The silence in the catering kitchen stretched out heavy and absolute, broken only by the distant muffled bass of the live band playing in the grand hall. I slowly raised my gaze back to his bloodshot eyes. I let a perfectly calm, dangerously flat expression settle over my features. "That sounds like federal wire fraud, Preston," I stated. My voice was completely steady, cutting through his frantic energy like a scalpel. Preston let out a harsh, ugly sneer. His grip on my arm tightened for a brief second before he shoved me backward, releasing me as if touching me was suddenly beneath him. He crossed his arms over his chest, puffing himself up to regain his artificial sense of authority. "It is only fraud if the actual owner finds out." Preston hissed, his lips curling into a wicked, condescending smile. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "And we both know that is never going to happen. You are going to sign the damn paper right now. If you refuse, I will walk straight back out there and have a very public conversation with my beautiful bride. I will have Vanessa tell your parents exactly what you did to try and sabotage her wedding. I will make sure they officially disown you tonight in front of half the state of Georgia. You will be entirely cut off, living on the streets with no family and no future. Now sign it." The absolute absurdity of his threat echoed in my mind. He genuinely believed that being disowned by my toxic, shallow parents was the ultimate leverage. He had no idea that I had mentally disowned them years ago, or that I was currently the only reason they were not facing federal trespassing and corporate liability charges. I looked at the heavy gold-plated fountain pen he had practically thrown onto the island next to the fraudulent power of attorney document. I slowly reached out. My fingers brushed against the cool metal of the pen. Preston immediately relaxed. A visible wave of arrogant relief washed over his sweaty face. He let out a long, shuddering breath and rolled his shoulders back fully, believing he had just successfully intimidated a helpless caterer into committing a major federal felony on his behalf. I picked up the pen. I held it perfectly poised over the signature line. Then, with deliberate, agonizing slowness, I set the pen down on the granite countertop. I picked up the fraudulent legal document, folded it in half with a crisp, precise crease, and slid it directly into the deep pocket of my black apron. "I will need to read the fine print first," I said smoothly, patting the pocket flat. Preston let out a low, arrogant chuckle. He did not care that I was delaying. In his desperate, clouded mind, the fact that I had taken the document meant I had accepted the bribe. He believed I was just trying to save face, playing the cautious employee, before inevitably doing exactly what he commanded. He reached out and snatched the torn envelope of cash off the counter, tapping it against his palm. "Take your time, Naomi." Preston smirked, his voice dripping with triumphant condescension. "You have exactly 1 hour. Read every single word if it makes you feel better. But have it signed and delivered to the bridal suite before the cake cutting, or the deal is off, and your family throws you out into the gutter." He adjusted his silk bow tie, shot me one final warning glare, and turned on his heel. He pushed through the heavy swinging doors, marching back out into the bright lights and loud music of his fake wedding reception, completely convinced he had just secured his $5 million lifeline. The moment the heavy kitchen doors swung shut, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The act was over. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the forged document. It was a beautiful piece of criminal evidence. He had literally handed me the physical proof of his intent to commit massive corporate real estate fraud. I pulled my secure encrypted smartphone from its hidden compartment in the pantry shelving. I completely bypassed my standard contacts and opened a direct, highly secure messaging channel that I only used for absolute corporate emergencies. I did not waste time calling the local police. Local authorities would be confused by the wealth, the glamour, and the complicated web of family drama. This situation required surgical federal intervention. I drafted a rapid, highly detailed text directly to my company's elite corporate counsel. I authorized them to initiate an immediate legal strike against Preston and his shell LLCs. Then I opened a second encrypted channel directly to a senior contact at the FBI Financial Crimes Division. My security clearance and my role in managing multi-million-dollar international assets gave me direct lines to people who did not play games with wire fraud and organized crime syndicates. I attached high-resolution photos of the power of attorney document Preston had just handed me. I attached the audio file of him begging the Miami loan sharks for 48 hours. I attached the video of him violently kicking the vase and the complete background dossier detailing his $3 million debt to a known criminal enterprise. I outlined exactly how he was attempting to leverage my employer's corporate property to satisfy an illegal debt. The trap was fully armed. The evidence was irrefutable, completely documented, and currently sitting in federal inboxes. I tucked my phone away and walked over to the kitchen's internal security monitor. I checked the camera feeds. Aunt Denise was standing exactly where I had placed her, an immovable sentinel by the main foyer exits. The heavy steel perimeter gates remained locked down tight. The red lights on the control panel glowed steadily, confirming that the entire estate was a sealed vault. Preston thought he had an hour to wait for my signature. He was currently out there drinking champagne and smiling for the cameras, completely unaware that federal agents were already mobilizing. I smoothed my apron, took a deep, calming breath, and prepared to walk back out into the main hall. It was time to watch the house of cards finally collapse. I took one final look around the sterile stainless steel kitchen before shedding the disguise. I reached behind my back and untied the knot of the cheap black catering apron. I let the stiff, uncomfortable fabric slide off my shoulders and drop to the floor. I kicked it aside and threw the plain black uniform shirt right into the nearest industrial trash bin. Underneath the humiliating catering costume, I was already wearing my actual armor. It was a stunning, custom-tailored designer jumpsuit in a deep, commanding emerald green. The sharp, asymmetrical cut and flawless silk draping projected absolute authority and uncompromising power. I smoothed my hands down the sides, feeling the heavy forged power of attorney document securely tucked into the concealed pocket. I took a few seconds to unpin my hair, letting it fall freely over my shoulders, completely erasing the invisible submissive caterer persona I had played all evening. I pulled my secure management tablet from its hiding spot one final time and checked the live perimeter feeds. Right on schedule, a line of sleek, dark vehicles pulled up silently to the reinforced front gates. There were no sirens, just the rhythmic, alternating flash of red and blue tactical lights reflecting off the wrought iron. The local police department had arrived. The FBI Financial Crimes Division worked incredibly fast when presented with a neatly wrapped package of wire fraud and organized crime ties. My screen blinked with an incoming encrypted authorization request from the lead tactical officer outside. I tapped the green icon on my screen, remotely disengaging the heavy magnetic locks on the main entrance. The massive steel gates glided open just enough to allow the fleet of police cruisers to roll quietly onto the estate grounds. I watched through the digital feed as heavily armed officers swiftly and silently established a hard perimeter around the reception hall. They were cutting off every possible avenue of escape before anyone inside even knew the music was about to stop. I locked the tablet, placed it securely inside a locked drawer in the prep station, and walked toward the swinging double doors. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped back out into the chaotic, glittering spectacle of the masquerade ball. The volume of the room hit me instantly, a suffocating wall of brassy jazz music, clinking crystal, and loud artificial laughter. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the distinct smell of desperation. But this time I did not lower my head. I did not shrink against the walls or attempt to blend into the shadows. I stood tall, my shoulders squared, and let the sheer radiant energy of my true self radiate outward. I looked across the vast expanse of the ballroom, scanning the crowd, until my eyes locked onto the main foyer exits. Aunt Denise was standing exactly where I had placed her. She looked like an absolute force of nature. She caught my eye across the sea of moving bodies. She took in my designer jumpsuit, the fierce determination in my posture, and a slow, razor-sharp smile spread across her face. She gave me a single distinct nod of profound approval. The exits were secured. The authorities were waiting just outside the mahogany doors. The trap was flawlessly set. I turned my attention away from Denise and locked my gaze directly onto the center of the grand ballroom. Vanessa and Preston were holding court beneath the massive crystal chandelier. I stepped forward and began to walk. I moved with deliberate, unhurried precision, weaving my way through the dense crowd of elite Atlanta socialites and Preston's imported fake billionaire friends. My emerald jumpsuit caught the light, a stark, brilliant contrast to the sea of black tuxedos and pastel gowns. I did not apologize as I moved past people. I did not yield my space. The guests instinctively parted from me, sensing the sudden palpable shift in my energy. They stopped their hollow conversations, their eyes tracking my progress, as I cut a direct path across the marble floor. The invisible servant was gone. The sister they had mocked and dismissed was gone. I was the executioner walking straight toward the guillotine. As I drew closer to the center of the room, the details of my targets came into sharp focus. Vanessa was holding a flute of vintage champagne, throwing her head back in forced theatrical laughter at a joke told by one of Preston's supposed venture capital partners. She was completely intoxicated by the illusion of her own manufactured success. Preston stood rigidly beside her, his smile tight and incredibly brittle. He was clutching his phone in his free hand, his knuckles white, his eyes constantly darting toward the hallway leading to the kitchen. He was anxiously waiting for me to return with the forged document that would save his miserable life. He had absolutely no idea that his salvation was an illusion, that his wealth was a total fabrication, and that the quiet, obedient sister he had just threatened was currently holding the detonator to his entire existence. I closed the final distance between us, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. I stepped directly into the bright, flashing circle of the hired photographer's lights, stopping right in front of the happy couple. I crossed my arms over my chest, perfectly calm, and waited for them to finally see me. I stood perfectly still, bathed in the harsh white glare of the photographer's flashbulbs. But before Vanessa or Preston could register my presence, Preston suddenly pivoted. He grabbed a silver serving spoon off a passing waiter's tray and tapped it firmly against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp, high-pitched ringing cut sharply through the chaotic noise of the room. The loud jazz band abruptly stopped playing mid-measure. The hundreds of overlapping conversations died down to an expectant hush. All eyes in the grand reception hall turned toward the sweeping marble staircase at the back of the room. Preston took Vanessa by the hand and led her up 3 marble steps, deliberately positioning themselves so they were physically looking down on everyone in the room. It was a textbook narcissistic power play. He cleared his throat and projected his voice using that fake, polished, aristocratic tone he had undoubtedly practiced in front of a dirty mirror. "I would like to thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate our union." Preston began, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He pulled Vanessa closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Vanessa is my equal in every way, a true partner in life and in business." He swept his free arm out in a grand theatrical gesture, encompassing the entire massive ballroom. "And Vanessa and I are absolutely thrilled to welcome you to our newest asset, the lake house." A ripple of impressed murmurs washed through the crowd. I stood motionless, my arms crossed, mesmerized by the sheer, unfiltered delusion pouring out of his mouth. "My firm will be officially taking over this property tomorrow morning to begin extensive renovations," Preston declared, his voice rising with manufactured authority. "We are going to turn this historic estate into an exclusive invite-only country club for the true elite of Atlanta." The crowd erupted into rapturous applause. They were clapping for a mirage, cheering for a monumental lie. Down in the front row, directly at the foot of the stairs, my parents Beatrice and Marcus were practically vibrating with manic joy. They had physically pushed past several wealthy guests to ensure they were seen standing as close to the groom as possible. Beatrice was actually weeping. She dabbed at the corners of her eyes with a lace handkerchief, being incredibly careful not to ruin her heavy, dramatic makeup. She turned to a wealthy local socialite, standing right next to her, a woman my mother had been desperately trying to impress for 5 years. My mother spoke loudly, making absolutely sure her voice carried over the applause. "Our son-in-law is a true visionary," Beatrice declared, her voice thick with manufactured pride. "We are just so blessed. He is so much better than my other daughter Naomi, who just fetches the drinks and cleans up after the real adults." Marcus nodded pompously beside her, puffing out his chest. "Absolutely right, dear. Preston is a man of action." I heard every single word. The blatant, unapologetic cruelty of it washed over me, but it did not hurt. It did not make me want to shrink away or hide. It actually fueled the cold, calculating fire burning in my chest. I stepped fully out of the periphery and walked directly into the open space at the base of the staircase. The crowd began to part. The elite guests, the fake billionaires, the desperate social climbers, they all instinctively stepped back as I moved through them. They noticed the deep emerald silk of my custom-tailored designer jumpsuit. They noticed the flawless, asymmetrical cut, the way the fabric draped perfectly, projecting an aura of undeniable old money power that made the rented tuxedos and gaudy sequined gowns around me look like cheap costumes. Whispers began to ripple outward through the ballroom like a wave. People were pointing. They recognized me as the woman who had been silently pouring their champagne an hour ago, but they could not reconcile that submissive image with the woman currently striding toward the groom like a predator cornering its prey. The murmurs grew louder, a confused, buzzing hive of gossip. Preston looked down from his elevated position on the marble stairs. His confident, arrogant smile froze completely. He stared at me, his eyes widening in pure shock, his brain struggling to comprehend what he was looking at. He expected to see a terrified, defeated catering assistant wearing a black apron, trembling and holding a signed, forged power of attorney document. He expected submission. He expected me to quietly hand him the keys to his salvation so he could pay off the Miami loan sharks. Instead, he saw me standing tall, my shoulders squared, the emerald silk of my jumpsuit catching the light. My arms were casually crossed over my chest, my empty hands in plain view. I looked up at him, my expression devoid of any fear, hesitation, or respect. I raised one eyebrow, a silent, damning challenge directed entirely at him. Preston's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. The color drained rapidly from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray beneath the bright chandelier lights. The realization began to violently dawn on him. The clock was ticking down. His debts were calling, and the one person he thought he could easily intimidate into committing federal wire fraud had just walked out into the middle of his reception, looking like she owned the very ground he was standing on. Because in every practical legal sense regarding this property, I did. Vanessa frowned, noticing the sudden silence and the direction of the crowd's stares. She looked down and saw me. Her eyes widened, taking in the designer clothes and my commanding posture. "Naomi!" She snapped, her voice shrill and confused. "What are you wearing? Get back in the kitchen." I ignored her completely. I kept my eyes locked on Preston. The stage was set perfectly. The audience was captive. The authorities were parked silently outside the iron gates waiting for my signal. I uncrossed my arms and took one deliberate step up the marble staircase. It was time to burn this illusion to the ground. I took the second step, then the third. The marble was cool and solid beneath my designer heels. A hired audio technician had just slipped a sleek wireless microphone into Preston's sweaty palm so he could properly project his grand fabricated announcements to the back of the room. I did not give him the chance to use it. I moved with a fluid, predatory grace, stepping directly onto the landing right between the golden couple. Preston was too paralyzed by the sudden shocking transformation of my appearance to react. His mouth hung open slightly, his eyes wide and vacant. I reached out and snatched the microphone directly out of his hand. His fingers yielded instantly, completely limp with disbelief. The feedback from the microphone whined sharply for a fraction of a second before the audio technician frantically adjusted the levels. The crowd gasped in unison, a collective sharp intake of breath from 300 high society guests. Vanessa's manufactured glowing smile shattered instantly into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She lunged forward, her expensive silk gown swishing violently around her ankles. Her eyes were wide with manic entitlement, completely unable to process how the sister she viewed as a servant was currently stealing her spotlight. "Are you insane?" Vanessa hissed, her voice vibrating with venom, though she kept it just low enough to avoid the microphone's pickup. She turned wildly toward the perimeter of the room, frantically waving her arms. "Security! Get this maid out of here right now!" I did not even glance at the hired guards standing by the walls. They were Aunt Denise's people, and they were not going to move a single muscle against me. I looked at Vanessa. I saw the ugly, spoiled core of the sister who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself. I felt absolutely nothing for her. I brought the microphone to my lips. I looked out over the sea of shocked faces past my horrified parents in the front row and let my voice echo off the vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom. "Welcome to the lake house, everyone." I stated, my tone perfectly smooth and dangerously calm. "I am so glad you could all be here to witness this, but Preston, you made a slight mistake in your speech." I turned my head just enough to lock eyes with the sweating groom. "You do not own this property, and you never will." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. You could have heard a pin drop on the polished marble floor. I looked down at Beatrice and Marcus. My mother's mouth was forming a silent oval, her lace handkerchief suspended in mid-air. My father looked like he had been physically struck by a heavy blow. They were witnessing the systematic dismantling of their prized son-in-law, and their brains simply could not comprehend that the executioner was their discarded, supposedly worthless daughter. Let me clarify the ownership structure for the distinguished guests. I continued pacing slowly across the top of the stairs, fully commanding the stage. The lake house is not a distressed asset, waiting for a venture capital takeover. It is not a blank canvas for a new country club. It is the flagship property of Horizon Corporate Holdings, and I am the sole owner and CEO of Horizon. I watched the color completely drain from Preston's face. The reality of his colossal miscalculation was finally crushing him under its immense weight. He had not just threatened a vulnerable caterer, he had threatened the billionaire owner of the estate he was actively trying to steal. His knees physically buckled slightly, his hands shaking at his sides. "There will be no exclusive country club." I projected clearly into the microphone, my voice cutting through the thick, tense air. "There will be no renovations funded by illicit Miami loans, and there will certainly be no transfer of assets to Preston's fraudulent shell companies." Vanessa grabbed Preston's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging deep into the fabric of his tuxedo jacket. "Preston, what is she talking about? Tell her to shut up. Make her stop," she demanded, her voice shrill and echoing slightly in the quiet room. Preston could not speak a single word. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as his eyes darted frantically toward the exits, only to find the heavy mahogany doors firmly blocked by Denise's stoic, immovable security team. He was trapped inside his own magnificent lie. I reached into the concealed pocket of my emerald jumpsuit. I pulled out the crisp white power of attorney document he had practically thrown at me in the kitchen. I held it up high, presenting it to the entire room as irrefutable proof. "Less than 20 minutes ago, the groom cornered me in the catering kitchen," I announced, ensuring every single syllable was razor sharp. "He presented this forged legal document. He explicitly threatened to have my family disown me and cut me off completely if I did not sign over the deed to this estate. He needed my signature to illegally leverage this property to cover his $3 million debt to a violent organized crime syndicate." The crowd erupted. It was not polite murmuring. It was a loud, chaotic explosion of outraged shock and furious disbelief. The venture capitalists Preston had invited began shouting angrily at each other, instantly realizing they had been brought to a fraudster's charade to serve as props. Beatrice grabbed Marcus's arm, her legs giving way as she slumped against a decorative marble pillar. The illusion of her perfect family was disintegrating live on stage. I turned my full attention back to Preston. He looked like a cornered, terrified animal. "You thought you were dealing with a helpless employee, Preston. You thought my family's toxic favoritism gave you the ultimate leverage. But you failed to do your basic due diligence. You failed to realize that I bought out the catering company 2 years ago just to monitor my domestic properties anonymously. You failed to realize that I hold the keys, the deed, and the security feeds." I lowered the microphone slightly, stepping directly into his personal space, letting the devastating weight of my words settle over him. "The charade is over, Preston. Your time is entirely up." Preston's face went from a sickly, terrified gray to a violently flushed, mottled red. The veins in his neck bulged against his tight silk collar. His entire manufactured persona completely disintegrated, leaving only the desperate cornered criminal underneath. "You crazy bitch, give me that!" Preston roared, his voice cracking as he completely abandoned his fake aristocratic accent. He lunged forward, his hands clawing wildly for the microphone and the forged document in my grasp. I anticipated the move entirely. I took a swift, graceful step backward, smoothly pivoting out of his reach. My designer heels planted firmly on the marble step above him, maintaining my high ground. With my free hand, I reached into the side pocket of my jumpsuit and pulled out a sleek black digital remote. I did not break eye contact with his frantic bloodshot eyes as my thumb firmly pressed the silver button in the center. A low mechanical hum instantly vibrated through the grand ballroom. High above the sweeping staircase, a concealed panel in the vaulted frescoed ceiling slid open. A massive high-definition projector screen began to unroll, descending slowly and majestically, right behind Preston and Vanessa. The murmurs of the crowd spiked into a wave of intense, confused anticipation. Every guest in the room craned their neck, watching the heavy canvas drop into place. A high-powered digital projector mounted in the balcony flared to life. A crisp, blindingly bright image illuminated the massive screen, casting a harsh white glow over the bride and groom. It was not a romantic slideshow of the happy couple. It was a high-resolution, digitally magnified image of an official state-certified property deed. The crest of the state of Georgia sat proudly at the top, followed by the complex, irrefutable legal descriptions of the estate boundaries. But the most important detail was highlighted directly in the center of the screen. In giant, bold, undeniable black lettering, the registered owner was listed as Naomi Adams. I brought the microphone back to my lips. A perfectly genuine, triumphant smile spread across my face. "I am not the property manager," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute uncompromising finality. "And I am certainly not the maid. I am the sole owner of this $4.5 million estate. It was purchased in cash, completely unencumbered by my luxury real estate firm exactly 3 months ago." The crowd erupted. It was a chaotic, deafening wave of shocked whispers, loud gasps, and frantic predatory gossip. The high society guests who had spent the entire evening drinking Preston's champagne and kissing the ring of the supposed new country club king turned on him in a fraction of a second. The venture capitalists in the front rows began aggressively pointing at the massive screen, pulling out their own smartphones to snap photos of the deed. The illusion of Preston's massive wealth was completely and utterly shattered. He was standing on a stage he did not own, attempting to steal a house he could not afford, caught red-handed by the very woman he thought was beneath his notice. I shifted my piercing gaze down to the front row. Beatrice and Marcus were frozen, perfectly paralyzed like tragic, overdressed statues. Their jaws had literally dropped to the floor. My mother's heavily powdered face had turned the color of chalk. She clutched frantically at the diamond necklace around her throat as if she were actively suffocating on her own arrogance. The daughter she had spent years mocking, the daughter she had proudly banished to the kitchen to fetch drinks for the real adults, was standing above her as a multi-million-dollar magnate. Marcus was sputtering, his mouth opening and closing rapidly, without a single sound coming out. His entire worldview, built entirely on superficial status and misplaced pride in his wealthy son-in-law, had just collapsed into toxic dust. He looked from the giant screen to me, his eyes wide with a horrific blend of shock and dawning realization. Vanessa looked like she was going to be physically sick. She stared at the giant projection of my name on the deed, her eyes tracking the bold black letters over and over again, as if trying to force the image to change. She slowly turned her head to look at Preston. The horrific reality was sinking into her shallow mind. The man she had married for his immense wealth and endless connections was completely broke. He was deeply in debt to a violent criminal syndicate, and he was currently standing in front of 300 people, having his massive fraud exposed. And the sister she had relentlessly bullied, the sister she had just threatened to have thrown out by security, was the actual billionaire holding all the cards. Preston, Vanessa whispered, her voice trembling with rising panic and humiliation. Preston, what is she talking about? Tell them she is lying. Tell them you own this. Preston could not speak. He was staring blindly at the massive screen, his eyes wide and unblinking. He looked completely destroyed. The sheer magnitude of his failure had finally short-circuited his brain. He slowly turned his head to look at me, and for the first time all evening, I saw genuine, unadulterated terror in his eyes. He realized the trap had been perfectly flawlessly laid, and he had eagerly walked right into the very center of it. I watched the socialites who had ignored me all night suddenly look up at me with hungry, reverent awe. Money and power were the only currencies these people actually respected, and I had just revealed that I held the keys to the entire vault. I let the heavy silence stretch out over the room, allowing the crushing weight of reality to fully settle over my toxic family. Beatrice reached out a trembling hand toward me from the bottom of the stairs. Naomi? She rasped, her voice completely stripped of its usual arrogant command. Naomi, sweetheart, what is this? What is going on? I looked down at her, my expression completely flat. What is going on? Beatrice is the end of the line. You bet everything on a shiny hollow shell of a man because you were too blind and too obsessed with status to see the truth. You happily let him treat me like garbage because you thought he was your golden ticket to the upper echelon. I turned my fierce attention back to Preston. You needed $5 million by tomorrow morning, I said into the microphone, making absolutely sure the entire room heard his exact desperate price tag. You thought you could forge my signature, steal my asset, and slip away into the night. But you are not a mastermind, Preston. You are just a desperate, sloppy con artist who made the fatal mistake of threatening the wrong woman in her own house. Vanessa's entire body went rigid. The desperate, fabricated reality she had meticulously constructed around herself was being violently torn apart, and her mind simply refused to accept it. She lunged forward, placing herself between me and her trembling groom, her fists clenched so tightly her knuckles were stark white. You are lying! Vanessa screamed, her voice tearing through the silent ballroom like shattered glass. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. This is a trick, you hacked the projector. You are nothing but a broke loser, Naomi. You are a pathetic, jealous little catering maid trying to ruin my perfect day, because you will never have a fraction of what I have. She was panting, her chest heaving against the restrictive bodice of her incredibly expensive wedding gown. She spun around to face the crowd, holding her hands up in a frantic, pleading gesture. Do not listen to her. She is mentally unstable. My husband is a venture capitalist. We are old money. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply held up the black remote, making sure Vanessa's manic eyes tracked the movement. I pressed my thumb against the button. A loud electronic chime echoed from the speakers, and the 20-foot projector screen behind them instantly shifted. The pristine property deed vanished, replaced by a dense, undeniable collage of heavily redacted but perfectly legible financial documents. The words, Chapter 11, Bankruptcy, were stamped in glaring red ink across the largest file. Next to it were dozens of past due notices, final warnings, and frozen account statements from offshore banks. Your old money white knight is completely broke, Vanessa, I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy, suffocating air of the ballroom. In fact, broke would be a massive step up for him. I tapped the screen on my tablet, bringing a specific, highly damning document to the center of the giant projection. It was a digital ledger completely decoding the shell companies Preston had used to hide his financial ruin. Preston does not manage a venture capital firm, I explained to the captivated audience. He manages a $3 million debt to a violent underground loan shark syndicate operating out of Miami. He is currently facing federal wire fraud charges, massive corporate liability, and a rather pressing deadline from some very dangerous men who want their money by tomorrow morning. I looked directly at Preston. He was completely broken, staring at the floor. His shoulders slumped as the Atlanta elite he had tried so hard to impress backed away from him in physical disgust. The venture capitalists in the front row were already typing furiously on their phones, likely calling their own legal teams to sever any ties with his toxic name. He has been trying to force me to forge the deed to this house so he could secure an illegal secondary mortgage to pay off the mafia, I stated, letting the absolute gravity of the crime settle over the room. He married you, Vanessa, because he needed a fast, high-profile event to legitimize his fake portfolio. You were nothing but a convenient, gullible prop in his survival scheme. Vanessa gasped, stepping away from Preston as if he had suddenly caught fire. She pressed her hands to her mouth, tears of pure humiliation finally spilling over her heavily powdered cheeks. She looked out at the crowd, playing the role of the devastated, betrayed bride to absolute perfection. "How could you?" Vanessa sobbed, slapping Preston weakly on the chest. "You lied to me. You told me you were wealthy. You promised me a life of luxury. I am a woman of high social standing, and you humiliated me. You conned me." I let out a low, sharp laugh that cut through her theatrical sobbing. The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of her performance was almost too beautiful to interrupt, but I had one final card to play. "Oh, please, Vanessa, spare us the victim routine," I said, raising the remote one last time. "You are not a tragic heroine. You are just a terrible investor." I pressed the button. The giant screen shifted for the third and final time. Preston's bankruptcy filings dissolved, replaced by a vibrant, chaotic display of high-interest financial statements. They were not elegant bank ledgers. They were garish, brightly colored printouts from predatory payday loan companies, maxed-out introductory credit cards, and aggressively structured personal installment loans. The interest rates, some hovering at a staggering 30%, were highlighted in bright yellow. "And Preston," I said, turning my gaze to the ruined groom, "your high society bride took out $150,000 in predatory payday loans just to pay for this fake elite wedding." Preston's head snapped up. He stared at the screen, his bloodshot eyes tracing the massive six-figure debt attached directly to his new wife's name. The shock jolted him out of his paralyzed state. "Every single thing you see tonight was bought on borrowed time and toxic credit." I continued pacing slowly across the marble landing. The designer dress, the vintage champagne, the imported orchids, the string quartet. Vanessa maxed out 8 different credit cards and signed away her future to underground lenders just to maintain the illusion that she belonged in your tax bracket. I stopped right between them, looking from my sister's horrified face to Preston's furious, betrayed expression. The absolute poetic justice of the moment hung perfectly in the air. "You two broke scammers married each other, desperately hoping to steal from the other," I declared, my voice echoing with finality. "Preston, you thought you were marrying into a gullible, wealthy family that you could bleed dry. Vanessa, you thought you were locking down a billionaire who would pay off your massive mounting debts. You both played the exact same con on the exact same day, and you both lost." The silence shattered. The grand ballroom erupted into a cacophony of vicious, mocking laughter and scandalized whispers. The high society guests, the very people Vanessa had starved and bled to impress, were openly pointing at her and sneering. The illusion of the golden couple was dead, replaced by 2 desperate grifters staring at each other with pure, unadulterated hatred. Down at the foot of the stairs, the destruction of the family facade was complete. Beatrice let out a strangled, breathless wail and physically collapsed into Marcus's arms. Her prized, perfect daughter, the one she had elevated and worshipped for years, was deeply in debt to payday lenders. Her visionary son-in-law was a broke, mafia-hunted criminal, and the daughter she had treated like a worthless servant had just exposed them all while standing in a $4.5 million estate that she owned outright. Vanessa looked at me, her face contorted with a mixture of rage and complete despair. She opened her mouth to scream, to hurl another insult, but the words died in her throat. There was nothing left to say. The screen behind her glowed brightly, casting the ugly, undeniable truth over the entire room. The game was over, the house had won, and I was the only one holding the chips. Preston's parents, who had spent the entire evening bragging to anyone who would listen about their son's massive venture capital success, stood paralyzed near the edge of the dance floor. The color drained from their faces so rapidly they looked like wax figures. His mother pressed a trembling hand over her mouth, her eyes darting frantically between the glowing projector screen and her son. His father physically took a step backward, creating a visible distance between himself and the criminal standing on the stairs. They were completely ghost white, utterly humiliated by the public execution of their family name. Preston saw them step away. He looked at the venture capitalists shaking their heads in disgust. He looked at Vanessa, who was now openly sobbing and ruining her expensive professionally applied makeup. Finally, his bloodshot eyes locked onto me. I was standing there perfectly composed in my emerald silk, holding the absolute proof of his destruction. The realization that his life was completely over finally shattered his mind. The carefully crafted, arrogant facade vanished, completely replaced by pure primal rage. He snapped, "I am going to kill you!" Preston roared, a guttural, terrifying sound that ripped through the ballroom. He balled his hands into tight fists and charged up the marble steps, launching himself directly at me. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply watched him come, knowing perfectly well that the stage was already set. Before Preston could take even 2 full steps toward me, the crowd violently parted. 3 men in tailored suits who had spent the evening quietly sipping sparkling water near the catering exits suddenly burst forward with terrifying speed. They were moving alongside 2 heavily armed uniformed police officers who poured in through the side doors. The lead plainclothes agent hit Preston like a freight train. The impact was brutal and loud, a sickening thud of flesh and bone meeting the solid marble floor. Preston let out a sharp cry as the air was violently forced from his lungs. The second agent grabbed his flailing right arm, twisting it sharply behind his back, while one of the uniformed officers dropped a heavy knee squarely between Preston's shoulder blades, pinning him securely to the cold stone. "Stay down, do not move," the lead agent commanded, his voice carrying the unmistakable booming authority of federal law enforcement. Preston writhed and thrashed against the marble, his expensive tuxedo jacket ripping at the seam as he struggled uselessly against the overwhelming weight of the officers. The sheer violence of the takedown sent shockwaves of panic through the elite crowd. Guests shrieked and scrambled backward, designer heels slipping on the polished floor as they fought to get out of the way. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a severe expression, reached into his jacket pocket. He did not pull out a weapon. Instead, he produced the crisp, white blank forgery document that I had discreetly handed over to his team exactly 20 minutes ago, right after Preston had threatened me in the kitchen. He held the forged power of attorney up high, ensuring the entire room and the struggling man on the floor could clearly see the federal evidence. "Preston Vance, you are under arrest," the lead FBI agent announced, his voice slicing cleanly through the chaotic shouting of the terrified guests. "You are being charged with attempted wire fraud, financial extortion, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud." Preston stopped struggling. He pressed his bruised cheek against the marble floor, panting heavily, his eyes squeezed shut in absolute defeat. But the agent was not finished. Furthermore, the agent continued, retrieving a heavy set of steel handcuffs from his belt. "We are executing multiple outstanding federal warrants issued by the state of Florida for racketeering and money laundering." The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs snapping securely around Preston's wrists echoed loudly throughout the massive ballroom. It was the sound of absolute finality, the sound of a fake billionaire being officially reduced to a federal inmate. The officers hauled Preston roughly to his feet. His designer bow tie was torn, his shirt was stained with dirt from the floor, and his carefully styled hair was plastered to his sweating forehead. He looked pathetic. The ultimate humiliation was fully underway, and the Atlanta high society crowd was not about to miss a single second of it. Hundreds of smartphones suddenly rose into the air like a glowing sea of fireflies. The flashbulbs fired in a blinding, relentless sequence. The wealthy socialites, the venture capitalists, the local politicians, they were all actively recording every humiliating detail of the arrest. They were broadcasting the spectacular downfall of Preston Vance and Vanessa Adams live to the entire world. The internet would have the footage before the police cruisers even left the driveway. Vanessa was screaming hysterically now, a high-pitched grating sound that clawed at the ears. She was completely ignored by everyone. Her friends, her bridesmaids, the people she had borrowed $150,000 to impress, were all too busy filming her ruined groom being dragged away in chains. Beatrice and Marcus remained frozen at the bottom of the stairs. My mother was clutching her chest, taking short, ragged breaths as she watched the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers strobing through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the ballroom. The sirens wailed loudly outside a harsh, screaming soundtrack to the destruction of her perfect social climbing fantasy. I stood completely still on the landing above them. The giant projector screen behind me continued to display the glaring, undeniable proof of their collective financial ruin. I looked down at Preston as the federal agents marched him past me. He did not lift his head. He did not look at me. He simply stared at his own scuffed shoes as he was led out the front doors and directly into the back of a waiting police vehicle. The room was a buzzing hive of scandalized gossip and flashing cameras. The entire wedding reception had transformed into a crime scene, and I had orchestrated every single second of it. I crossed my arms over my emerald silk jumpsuit, feeling the cool, refreshing air rushing in from the open doors. Justice had finally been served, and it tasted incredibly sweet. "Get your hands off me!" Preston shrieked, his voice cracking as the federal agents hauled him firmly toward the grand mahogany double doors. He twisted wildly against their iron grip, throwing one final venomous glare back at the sweeping staircase. He did not look at me. He looked directly at his bride. "You set me up, Vanessa. You worthless gold digger. You ruined me." The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind him, abruptly cutting off his frantic, desperate screaming. Vanessa did not chase after him. She did not defend him. Instead, her knees finally gave out entirely. She collapsed onto the hard marble steps, the voluminous layers of her custom silk gown pooling around her like a deflating parachute. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with ugly, gasping sobs. When she looked up, the pristine illusion of her bridal perfection was completely destroyed. Thick black tracks of designer mascara ran down her cheeks, staining her pale, trembling face. All around her, the merciless glow of smartphone screens illuminated her downfall. Her high society guests, the influencers and socialites she had carefully curated for her guest list, were live streaming every single agonizing second of her humiliation. I watched her desperately claw at her own purse, pulling out her phone with shaking fingers to look at her social media feeds. I did not need to see the screen to know what was happening. Her comments sections were undoubtedly flooding with the truth. Her carefully constructed, highly monetized influencer career was burning to the ground in real time, and there was absolutely no brand deal or apology video that could ever resurrect it. But the most disgusting display of the evening had not even happened yet. Down at the base of the staircase, my parents were finally recovering from their paralyzing shock. I watched their eyes dart from the weeping, financially ruined Vanessa on the stairs up to me, the billionaire owner of the estate standing victoriously on the landing. Their social climbing instincts overrode their basic parental loyalty in a matter of seconds. They realized Vanessa was a sinking ship, a massive liability burdened with payday loans and public disgrace. I, however, was the ultimate prize. Beatrice actually stepped directly over the trailing edge of Vanessa's wedding dress. She ignored her sobbing younger daughter completely and practically sprinted up the marble stairs toward me. Marcus was right behind her, his chest puffed out as he furiously attempted to adjust his crooked tuxedo tie. Beatrice stopped one step below me, her eyes shining with thick, entirely manufactured tears. She reached out with both hands, attempting to pull me into a tight, loving embrace. I took a deliberate half-step back, keeping my arms firmly crossed over my emerald silk jumpsuit. She let her hands fall undeterred by my physical rejection. "Naomi, our brilliant daughter," Beatrice cried out, her voice thick with fake, overflowing emotion. "We always knew you were special. We always knew you were destined for greatness. We are so proud of you." Marcus nodded vigorously, offering me a wide, eager smile that made my stomach turn. "Absolutely incredible, sweetheart," he boomed, attempting to sound like a proud patriarch. "You completely outsmarted him. Please, Naomi, we are family. We need to stick together now more than ever." I stared at them. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no lingering desire for their affection. There was only absolute freezing ice in my veins. I looked at the two people who had spent my entire life grinding my self-esteem into the dirt, the people who had proudly watched Vanessa treat me like garbage just a few hours prior. "Do not call me your daughter," I stated, my voice dropping to a low, deadly calm that immediately wiped the eager smiles off their faces. "You do not get to claim my success when you contributed absolutely nothing but sabotage." Beatrice's lower lip quivered. "Naomi, please, you are just upset about earlier. We were just trying to push you to reach your full potential. You were ashamed of me because I didn't fit your pathetic bootlicking narrative," I corrected her sharply, ensuring my words carried over the lingering murmurs of the crowd. "You wanted a shiny, superficial trophy to parade around the country club, and you chose Vanessa. You chose a mirage. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice." Marcus stepped forward, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me, the way he always had when I was a child. "Now listen here, Naomi. You cannot speak to your parents that way. We are your family, and you will show us some respect." I did not back down an inch. I met his aggressive stare with unwavering authority. "You aren't my family," I told him, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "You are trespassers." I broke eye contact with my stunned father and looked over the balcony railing, locking eyes with the lead commander of the private security team standing by the main entrance. He had been waiting for my order all evening. I raised my hand and gave him a single sharp signal. "Throw them all out," I commanded. The security team moved with terrifying synchronized efficiency. 6 burly guards in dark suits marched directly toward the grand staircase. 2 of them flanked Beatrice and Marcus. My father tried to puff out his chest and argue, but a guard simply clamped a massive hand onto his shoulder and physically turned him toward the exit. Beatrice began to wail a shrill, genuine sound of panic as she was forcefully guided down the stairs. 2 more guards reached Vanessa. They did not offer her a hand up. They grabbed her by the elbows, hauling the sobbing, mascara-stained bride to her feet. She kicked and screamed, her expensive dress tearing as she fought against their iron grip, but they dragged her effortlessly across the marble floor. The remaining guards began sweeping the perimeter of the ballroom forcefully, directing the lingering, gossiping guests toward the coat check and the valet. The grand party was officially over. The lights flickered brightly as the catering staff, my actual employees, began dismantling the floral arrangements and clearing the tables. I stood alone on the marble landing, the cool night air wrapping around me. I watched my parents and my sister get shoved out the front doors of my home, banished into the cold darkness. The massive chandelier above me sparkled brightly, illuminating the empty, quiet expanse of my property. The toxic weight that had suffocated me for my entire life was finally gone. I took a deep, steadying breath, turned on my heel, and walked upstairs to begin my new life. 2 weeks later, the lake house was finally exactly as I had originally envisioned it. The gaudy, rented wedding decorations had been completely stripped away by my staff the very next morning. The oppressive manufactured atmosphere of high society pretension was gone, replaced by the serene, quiet elegance of a home that was truly mine. I sat in the plush leather chair of my main floor study, the massive French doors open to let in the warm evening breeze off the water. I held a crystal glass of a remarkably rare vintage Bordeaux, swirling the dark red liquid gently as I looked out over the sweeping manicured lawn. A cheap plastic prepaid cell phone vibrated violently against the polished mahogany wood of my desk. I had purchased the burner phone a week ago and mailed the number to a post office box I knew my father still checked. It was a calculated decision. I wanted to control exactly how and when they could reach me, ensuring my actual personal and business lines remained completely untainted by their desperation. I let the phone rattle against the wood for a long moment, taking a slow, appreciative sip of my wine. The complex flavors grounded me. I picked up the small device and pressed the green button, holding it to my ear without saying a single word. The sound of ragged, heavy breathing filtered through the tiny speaker. Then came the frantic, high-pitched sound of a woman crying. It was not the theatrical, pretty weeping Vanessa used to garner sympathy online. It was the ugly, hyperventilating sound of total defeat. Over the past 14 days, the fallout from the wedding had been absolute and merciless. Preston was sitting in a federal holding facility in Florida, denied bail, and facing a laundry list of charges that would keep him incarcerated for decades. But the destruction of my immediate family had been a public spectacle of epic proportions. Vanessa's carefully curated influencer career had imploded overnight. The wedding footage had gone incredibly viral. Millions of people watched her scream at federal agents, and millions more scrutinized the leaked financial documents exposing her massive payday loans. Brands dropped her within hours. Her sponsors publicly disavowed her. The final crushing blow had come 3 days ago when the repossession company arrived at her luxury apartment complex. A neighbor had happily live-streamed the exact moment Vanessa's pristine leased white SUV was hooked up to a tow truck while she stood on the sidewalk screaming in her pajamas. Beatrice and Marcus had fared no better. The high society friends they had bankrupted themselves to impress had instantly slammed their doors shut. My parents were officially social pariahs. Beatrice had been politely but firmly asked to step down from her prestigious church committee. Marcus had been shunned at his beloved local country club, his membership quietly revoked after the board deemed his association with a federal fraudster too toxic for their brand. Their credit was completely destroyed from years of trying to keep up appearances, and with Preston's fake money gone, they were left with absolutely nothing. "Naomi?" Vanessa's voice cracked through the phone, thick with mucus and panic. "Naomi, please tell me you are there." I remained perfectly silent, letting her wallow in the uncomfortable void. "We lost the apartment," Vanessa sobbed, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. "The bank froze Mom and Dad's accounts. The landlord locked us out. We are sitting in this disgusting cheap motel off the highway, and we do not even have enough money to pay for another night. Naomi, I am begging you." In the background, I could hear Beatrice crying loudly. I heard Marcus muttering something pathetic and defeated. The mighty patriarch and matriarch were reduced to cowering behind their ruined golden child, hoping she could somehow manipulate the daughter they had thrown away. "Please, Naomi," Vanessa begged, her voice dropping to a desperate hoarse whisper. "Just let us use the guest house, just for a little while until we figure things out. We have nowhere to go. You have all that space. You have so much money. We are your family." I took another slow, deliberate sip of my wine. I looked out the open doors toward the water. The sun was just beginning its descent, painting the sky in breathtaking strokes of gold and lavender. I thought about the decades of emotional abuse. I thought about being forced to wear a caterer's apron in my own home. I thought about every time Vanessa had called me a socially unfit embarrassment simply because I chose hard work over shallow networking. "I am sorry, Vanessa," I said, my voice as cool and smooth as the glass in my hand. "But my lake house is only for people who are socially fit. Try Uber." I did not wait for her scream. I did not wait for Beatrice to snatch the phone and start wailing. I pulled the device away from my ear, pressed the end call button, and immediately popped the plastic back off. I pulled out the battery, snapping the cheap SIM card in half with my thumb. I tossed the broken plastic pieces directly into the wastebasket under my desk. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I stood up from my desk, smoothing the fabric of my casual linen trousers. I walked out of the study, passing through the grand living room, and stepped out the back doors onto the sprawling stone patio. The evening air was perfectly warm. I walked down the gentle slope of the lawn, following the illuminated stone path that led directly to my private deepwater dock. Sitting in a comfortable lounge chair at the end of the wooden pier was Aunt Denise. She looked incredibly relaxed in a flowing silk caftan, watching the sunset paint the rippling surface of the lake. Beside her sat a silver ice bucket, chilling a bottle of exceptionally rare champagne. She turned her head as I approached, her sharp, intelligent eyes taking in my peaceful expression. She did not ask about the phone call. She did not need to. She simply reached out, picked up 2 crystal flutes, and poured the sparkling wine. "To new beginnings," Denise said, handing me a glass with a warm, genuine smile. "And to the family we actually choose." "To the family we choose," I agreed softly. I sat down in the chair beside her. I raised my glass, listening to the gentle lapping of the water against the wooden pylons. I watched the final rays of the sun dip below the tree line, casting a brilliant fiery glow over the estate that belonged entirely to me. There were no more lies, no more toxic expectations, and no more hiding in the shadows. The past was permanently severed, and the future was entirely mine to build. I took a sip of the champagne, letting the bright, crisp bubbles wash over my tongue. I sat back, breathed in the fresh lake air, and watched the sun set on a beautiful, quiet, and perfectly triumphant life. The most profound lesson from this journey is that your true value is never determined by those who actively refuse to see it, even if they share your DNA. Toxic environments condition us to seek validation from the very people trying to keep us small. But real power comes from quiet, relentless resilience and building your own independence. Blood does not guarantee loyalty, and walking away from a table that disrespects you is not a failure, it is the ultimate victory. When you finally stop fighting for fabricated approval, you gain the absolute freedom to build your own beautiful, authentic life. Share your own experiences with setting healthy boundaries in the comments below, and hit subscribe to join a community that celebrates authentic strength and self-respect.